gonna be talking about narrative as design, uh, and I will be mainly using Thracia, Fire Emblem Thracia 776 as an example, because it's a game I've been playing lately. It's amazing. I'm probably gonna do a presentation about it in the future, but for now, we're just gonna use an example. So, why even bother? Why even bother doing narrative? There's a lot of reasons, but probably the one I feel more attached to is that I think video games are art. They have an amazing potential for human exploration and for the player to become a better person. And basically, we're not being taken seriously. And doing a complex, well thought narrative kind of is a fast solution to that. The problem is we are competing against a lot of more advanced media, filming, cinema, narrative, painting, music. They all have their own advantages. And luckily, we do have our advantages as well, which are those that I've listed: interactivity, adaptive pacing, etc. The whole thing, or what this can be summarized in, is that the player has the control. The player has the choice, and this is amazing because basically it means that any decision, the player has the responsibility for it. And also, if we're gonna be less presumptuous about these, we like stories. We like to see people struggle, so it's a great way to engage the player and whatnot. But that's more like a secondary thing for me. Then, what's this? This is gonna be the framework I'm gonna be talking about. The idea of this is that it's basically how you want to start designing a game from a narrative-centric perspective, and the core components will be the message, the mechanics, and the player. So let's go to the message. It's the fundamental piece of a game. Most games have an idea, a message, they have something they are about. Narrative games, it's 100%. Every good narrative game must have a message, must have something everything revolves around, because if not, the game is just not cohesion and it kind of feels like lame because you get to the end of the story and you don't really know what the game is about. So that's kind of the importance of the message. The message is, in my opinion, in my experience on writing stories, is the first thing you have to think about when you're gonna write a narrative. A very good example for this, and probably the most prominent in the industry, is That Game Company. They have said, they have explicitly stated that to design Flow, Flower, and Journey, they had a core message, a core idea at the center, which later developed into the mechanics, which later developed into the whole game. It's important, though, not to confuse the message or the thematics with the theme. In the case of Flower, for example, the theme was wind. In Flow, it was water. In Journey, it was desert. But the theme doesn't equal the thematic. For example, in the Flower, you could express that the thematic, the message, was freedom, while the theme was wind. And if those relate each other, they normally do. It's a good narrative tool to merge those together, but it's not the same thing. Now, what kind of narratives you can use to talk about your message? The traditional would be the narrative storytelling, which are the linear and branched. Linear storytelling basically is A is followed by B, which is followed by C, which is followed by D. Pretty standard. It's basically like you're reading a book or watching a film. It's just that you have some bits of interactivity in the middle. And then you have branched storytelling, which really is just a bunch of linear stories, but you can choose which one to go to. Not very complex. And we have then two concepts that I want to explore with a bit more time, which is basically reactive storytelling and emergent storytelling. I've heard this concept of emergent storytelling a lot, and it's something I'm not very fond of, let's say, because it's basically Minecraft. Minecraft is a good example of emergent storytelling, and I wouldn't really consider it storytelling. What's happening is that the player is taking a series of actions, and through that, he or she discovers themselves, express themselves, and whatnot. And that's fine. I don't think that's a wrong way of envisioning a narrative or an interactive experience. But what I would like video game industry to focus a bit more is on reactive storytelling, which is similar, but it's not the same. Reactive storytelling is focused on the idea that you can basically give the player all the agency, all the freedom, and based on what this player can do interacting with the environment, some events will trigger. And these events are narratives, are self-contained narrative that can relate to other kind of events that are also programmed and that create an overarching differentiated experience at every game, but keeping those messages and those themes and those lines that connect every thread in the narrative instead of just giving full agency to the player but not doing anything with that. I think it's a more complex way of envisioning storytelling, and I don't really know if it has been implemented successfully because my video game culture is not that abundant. But that I know, not really. No one has really traversed this space of the emergent storytelling of simply giving the player the freedom. Maybe the example that comes the closest is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, but it's still not really that because Breath of the Wild has a narrative that's somewhat linear. It's just that in the middle you can do kind of whatever you want. While my idea of reactive storytelling is more you make the narrative. There's no overarching goal or plot. And here we have this image of Thracia 776, which is relevant because as kawaii, which means cute by the one no whips in here, um, basically it's the idea that you are Leaf, you're this character, you're the main character, and you control a bunch of other characters. And you can basically have fun with them or you can kill them in horrible ways. And basically, it reinforces the themes of the game, which is leadership and about war. And it's something that Fire Emblem tends to talk about because it kind of, for the setting it has, it kind of derives into those thematics by default. But in Thracia 776, because of the context and how limited it was narratively due to things that I'm not going to talk about, thank you very much. Basically, those themes, those thematics are kind of elevated into the main thematics of the game. And we're going to talk more about Thracia, but later. Now, some more bits about the different kind of narratives, because if you're going to be making a narrative game, you might as well know what kind of narratives you can do and which you cannot. The linear narrative is very basic. Basically, you can more or less control what happens at every time, but you're taking agency from the player and you cannot really control the pacing because linear storytelling drinks a lot from what is narrative and cinema, uh, which is fine, but those kind of have a very important principle that is pacing, is controlling the emotionality of every moment to kind of coordinate it with the feelings of the spectator so that it feels more fun to traverse the whole story. In video games, you can't quite do that because, well, you can do it obviously, but it's more complicated because the player always has the choice of doing something else, or always has the choice of just roaming around looking at nothing interesting, and then your pacing kind of dies. Also, you have the fact that video games tend to be longer experiences, so you cannot control when the player is going to say, I'm leaving to go have lunch or something, and then come back. So it's not like a film that you watch it in one go. And this, therefore, the pacing has more contrivances. Then you have the branched storytelling, which is kind of the same. But one problem that I have specifically, and that's just because I care a lot about thematics, so a lot of people might just not really care. But for me, it has a problematic in how it discusses the thematic, because by giving numerous answers, it never really is clear what is the point or what is the opinion that's being kind of delivered. And I feel that branch narrative serves more as a way to explore a unique concept that doesn't really have a yes or no, a binary answer, and it's more just of the exploration of the idea itself, what has value or meaning. And obviously, a big problem that a lot of people feel discouraged to do branch narrative for is the high costs. And this is something that does not necessarily have to be a thing because you can kind of trick it. There was a game, there are a lot of videos talking about how to reduce costs in branch narratives. But for example, there was a game in which at some point they told you which side there was a war basically, and they said which side will you side with, and depending on which you choose, of course, the narrative changed because you now were aligned with someone that you were not before. But the whole thing, the whole map where the battle played, it was the same. The characters were the same. Everything played the same. It's just you are aligned to one forces or the others, and that changed the narrative. But if you look at the costs of how much it really was needed to develop to do that, it was nothing. You just implement a couple variables and then you change a bool to true or false, and then that kind of is it. So you can reduce cost. Branch narrative doesn't have to be expensive, even though it tends to be. And of course, in AAA products, it's way more expensive because expectations of the of players are going to be way higher. But generally, you can be intelligent about those and try to cut them. And finally, reactive storytelling. This is more dubious because, as I said, I have not seen it properly executed. So an analyze of what are its pros and cons is not gonna be that realistic because there's not a real base to kind of take it from. But in my opinion, the advantages it has, obviously, it's you can do whatever you want. You have full agency, and it's going to be a unique experience because it will depend on each person. And most importantly, is this line that says player is fully responsible. Video games have this great advantage that is the player gets to responsibilize themselves for their actions they do. But sometimes, if the narrative is kind of more delimited from before, you cannot quite feel like you're really being responsible for the actions. And therefore, maybe if the game is asking you to take a difficult moral choice or something that really gives insight to who you are as a person, you're like, well, it would give me insight if were it not because I can choose this or the bad option. So I kind of have to choose this by default. In this kind of idea of the reactive storytelling, you just have the full responsibility of what you're doing. Um, yeah, I think I'm going to leave it there. And obviously, the problem is that in this case, you cannot be intelligent with the costs. You have necessarily to develop a lot of scenarios, a lot of events to plan how they are going to relate to each other and to try to avoid people kind of breaking the game. In a way, it's kind of related to The Sims as well. Like The Sims kind of works as a reacting storytelling, but it's also not quite because in The Sims you also have it's more of emergent storytelling because you really have objectives, and it's true that the actions you do affect how the game plays, but it's not quite the same as what reactive storytelling kind of goes for. And obviously this means that a really another important factor in reactive storytelling is that you're going to have a higher dependence on player initiative. This basically means that if the player doesn't really feel like doing things, they might as well just go into the game, play it for 2 minutes, and then are like, nothing's happening, I'm bored, and quit. A good way to solve this would be to, for example, kind of implement a linear narrative to begin with, and at some point just say, hey, now you're at your own, do whatever you want. Somewhat like Breath of the Wild, what they did with the tutorials part, in which at the beginning they basically told you to go to those four sanctuaries and unite all those powers, and then the world is yours to explore. But as I said, Breath of the Wild kind of has a more overarching plot, and the stories are more self-contained, are not all intertwined. So I have uh, my considerations to do on that. Nonetheless, let's pass into mechanics. Okay, so mechanics are the actions of the game, they are the verbs, they are what the player can do, and most importantly, they are the embodiment of change. And this is very important because it means that every time you want to change the status quo, you can give the agency to the player to do it. You can um, make the player make the choice. And basically, that's what we call giving the player, or rather, using the full extension of the media to its fullest potential. Then, kind of mechanics, you can obviously classify them in lots of ways, but what I think for this system or for this framework are the most useful would be systematic and situational mechanics. Systematic meaning that they exist permanently within the system. In the case of Fire Emblem, as you can see, it's kind of like an XCOM. Instead of being futuristic, it's kind of more medieval with magic kind of setting, but the mechanics are, well, the core mechanics are somewhat similar. So systematic mechanic in this case would be, for example, movement. Like you have a certain range, you have a value that specifies how much you can move, and that's the number of tiles you move, and that applies for every single character in the game, no exceptions. And then you have situational mechanics. For example, in this map, there are certain points that if you step on them, you get teleported to random places. Well, it's not random, but you get teleported to places, and that's kind of only in this map, and it's a mechanic that will be used in a couple more maps in the future, but it's more situational. Or things, for example, like you can talk to certain characters, but that's only for those characters. It's not an action that you always have available to you. And then also you have player and reactive based mechanics. The player mechanics are the ones that the player does. And well, I call them reactive based mechanics, but it's more system based mechanics. I just didn't want to mix systematic with system. Basically, it's the idea that the game does things by itself. For example, a day-night cycle loop, like you're not choosing when it becomes day and when it becomes night. It's just something that the game does. But it's a mechanic because it's something that changes the status quo, is an action of the game. And basically, those are important on the consideration of when you're giving agency to the player, when you're taking it from them, and what kind of mechanic or how the mechanic informs the narrative. But we're not gonna go too deep into this because there's just too much to cover, and so I'd rather move on. As a last commentary, as I kind of stated before, it's important to understand that a narrative framework doesn't mean that you're gonna plan the story before the mechanics. That is dangerous. It can go well for reasons, but it's usually not. It's not a good idea. So the first part would be idealizing the message. What is it that we want to talk about? And then do the mechanics for that. Establish a genre, do whatever you need. If there's probably 100 frameworks that people like to take on how to develop games. So it's kind of fine to follow them as long as you have that message firstly and you adapt all those frameworks to the idea of implementing a message. And then once you've done the mechanics, you can implement the story. Because the story, as any minimal writing skilled person knows, is something that doesn't matter in the slightest. It's just a way to contextualize what you're trying to say. Unless you have like a very specific scene in your head, which I've had, and I've written stories just from that, and they sucked, because it's not a good idea to start writing from just a scene. In any case, the player. Now we've covered message and mechanic. We can go to the player. Very brief. We, as video game creators, know that a target exists. We know that there's people our games are catered to, but we don't care really. Like in this case, for the generic idealization of what a framework is, we're not gonna give too much importance to that because a good story doesn't really depend on who consumes it, and rather on how it's composed. The only important part of the player is that we have to consider it has an emotional and a rational part. And from there, kind of everything is going to steam. So the mood. The mood is the emotional part of the message. And basically, wait a moment, haven't, no, okay, good. Because I was just thinking if I have forgotten to explain something. Luckily, not yet. It will happen though. The mood, as I said, the emotional part of the message. This image I put is because in this map you get a character that's called Marita, and like she has been under some tough circumstances, and basically you arrive at this map and you're like, you get Marita, and you're very happy because it's cool to have her back, basically. And it doesn't really impact the narrative in any major way. There are some implications on what it means previously, like on her journey to get here, but getting her as a character doesn't really mean anything. It's narrative because it's a part of the story, but I think it's purely emotional, and that's why I did put it here. So what things influence this emotional part of the narrative? What do you have to consider when crafting a story and you want to make it emotional? Pacing is probably the most important part. There's a quote from Bakuman, I think it is, which is a manga, because of course I would reference a manga here. That's basically anyone who can tell a boring events in an interesting way, it's got to be a genius. And I totally agree. Like if you're capable of telling something mundane and make it interesting, you have a big brain. And that's because you are using the pacing correctly. And using pacing correctly is important. As I've said, in video games, it's more tricky than usual because you cannot control the state of mind of the player. In basically in films, what you do is you kind of lure the player in, well, the audience in, and once you've got them, you've got them. You don't have to win them again. In video games, every time that the player leaves or the player is interrupted or anything, you have to kind of gain their attention again, and you don't know when that's going to happen, so you cannot catch their attention, and therefore there might be times in which you just have lost the player for a full 20 minutes or something, and that's problematic. Nonetheless, there are ways to control pacing. There's a lot of information in the internet. I'm not going to go with deep here because it's just one thing, but it's very important to consider it. Narrative is very important as well. Narrative refers not to storytelling or story, because it concepts that we mix a lot, because their concept on the everyday life and their concept as the academic sense differ. But in this case, narrative refers to the academic sense, which is how you tell the story, not what happens in it, but the order, the tones, what parts do you decide to show of it. Obviously, that's gonna relates very heavily with pacing and therefore affects emotionality and therefore is part of the mood. And then you have all those three elements. I'm going to talk about them later, but it's basically the immersive fact of them. And what I'm basically says is don't break the immersion. Pretty simple. Captivation. Okay, for now we're gonna leave all those pretty words there because I have something to talk about this map. This map broke me because in the upper house, basically, well, to give you more context, this is the walls of this map are from Castle Leonster, and it's basically the castle that had been taken from you from the main character when he was little, when he was 5 or something like that. They exiled him, and now he's coming back to retake his country, and this is his home castle. And basically, you arrive here after like 17 maps. I think this is 17B map, and basically you arrive here and it's like, wow, I'm finally here. This is amazing. We're gonna do this. We can succeed. We can kind of win this war. And basically, when you arrive to the first house and you enter with Liv, who is the main character, basically an old man comes and is like, "We have been 10 years under the power and influence of this evil empire that has been conducting child hunts, or has been abusing the population. We are desperate, basically, and you have to take this castle." Now, one of the main gimmicks of this map is that behind the walls, basically you cannot attack them, there's a bunch of ballistas, which are like archers that hit you really hard and probably can kill all of your units in 2 hits, if not 3. So basically what the villager says, what the elder villager says is, we can be the bait for these ballistas. Basically, we can kill ourselves, and then you can enter the castle, retake it safely, and basically the game tells you to take a decision. Do you want to use the elder people as bait, or are you going to risk um, losing a lot of your units? Because there's like 7 or 8 of those ballistas, which means that to traverse all the space that you need to, you're going to take around 3 or 4 turns. So 4, 8 times 8, that's 32. So that you're going to lose around 16 units, which is like all of your units, and you cannot quite finish the game if you lose all of your units. So as you can see, it's quite of a problem. And basically, this is a moment that I think embodies captivation to the teeth, because you find yourself in this problematic of you have to choose, and it's so compelling because it's not a matter of is this wrong or is this good, or is this the proper way to play or is it not. It's a consideration that each person has to do of whether they want to take the risk of being hit and lose units to the ballistas, or if they are fine with sacrificing the people that have been waiting for the return of their prince for 10 years and have been under extreme suffering and everything. And of course, a key part I think of this is that the elder himself is like, we're willing to do this. You don't have to oblige us. We're more than satisfied to give our lives to this cause, right? So like, there's no reprobation to the player. No one's gonna look at him wrongly. It's purely a matter of if he or she considers it correct or considers it a valid strategy to do it. Because, in a sense, it makes like it's totally understandable because even if you take this castle back, it doesn't mean you've won the war. There's still a huge empire with huge troops that are going to fight you, and you're going to need your units. So there's a lot of complexity and nuance to this single moment, which is why it has broken me and it has haunted me for at least like a week now. And when I do the Thracia 776 presentation, I'm gonna go in this in more depth because Jesus Christ, this is breaking me in the inside. Nonetheless, the captivation is the rational part of the narrative. It's about the themes. It's about what it's talking about. Actually, it's thematics, not themes. Jesus, well, whatever. It's about the story. It's obviously how those themes are being presented. Because yes, there's also meaning and value within how those are presented. It also relates to the narrative concept of the emotional part, but you know, by itself, story does have value. A craft, I added craft here as kind of a bonus. It's not universal. Not everyone can appreciate the craft. We as game designers may feel more inclined to be admired for some decisions that Thracia takes, while someone that's just not playing or not very knowledgeable might play the game and be like, well, okay, whatever. Um, Aesthetics and sound and consistency and cohesion, all those have their immersion part in the mood, but in captivation they have also a value as part of the narrative. Obviously consistency and cohesion, like the story, the plot has to make sense. It's not so much that you are taking the player out of the experience, but like for the themes to be consistent, the story has to make sense in its own logic. I don't want, because I thought now, well, there are some stories that kind of don't really make sense, but that's because it's part of their identity, or because precisely the message is within how weird reality may feel, or whatever. Like there's 100 things you can kind of focus on describing something. So don't take it for granted as everything has to make perfect sense and has to be perfectly explained. But at least the important parts, the important bits should be cohesion. And on the aesthetics and sound department, obviously the way in which you portray both sound and images is gonna be unique. Like you can represent those in an infinity of ways, and the way that you choose to do it is gonna have, or it should have, some meaning. It should inform about the thematics and the message. And then we have world building, which is basically everything that helps give context. It's important. I don't think I need to explain why. Now we can go to the mechanics. The feel is the emotional part of the mechanics. It's basically, I don't want to say the gameplay because it's not quite that, but it comes close. It's basically how do you feel when you are playing the game by the sole fact of playing the game. So of course there's a degree of mastery that will influence how good you feel or not. For example, in fighting games, it's very prominent. If you're starting to play the fighting game, you're gonna feel like shit because you don't know what you're doing. You're gonna miss everything, and you're gonna lose a lot. And the gameplay will not change a bit. That when you have become accustomed to it, you'll feel like you're the god of the game, and you will feel unstoppable, and it's gonna be amazing. And literally nothing has changed, but how much you are capable to play the game itself. So there's that part. There's also physicality. It's not the same playing a game with keyboard, with pad, with a specialized pad. Sound and visuals, and like how does the game give feedback to the game. These requirements, I think it's very important, and it's something we don't think so easily or so fast on how to uh, exert the feelings of our mechanics. And it's basically, what do you need to do something? For example, doing a special attack in Street Fighter, for example. Yes, I'm going to use Street Fighter a lot for a lot of cases. Um, just the fact that it requires meter, the fact that it's a special attack that you can only have once, it gives it value, and it makes it feel more powerful and more important, even though it might just be a normal attack that does a bit more damage. Of course, there are also visuals and sound that reinforce even more this feeling, but the fact that something has a cost gives it more power, and that's feeling at the end of the day. Personalization, there are, for example, if you can boost your stats, or you can boost the level of an ability, and like new effects, kind of like new particles or whatever happen, that's also going to give it feel. Generated dynamics, of course, any way that the doing an action is going to inform the rest of the environment, is going to make you feel something, or at least it should be designed to do so. Effects, similarly, what are the consequences of doing um, that action, but not so much on the environment, but on oneself. Like what you, for example, may lose uh, moving speed, or you may lose some points of whatever, and that also has repercussions. Means that you have consideration and that it has a special value or a special consequence that affects feel. An emotional contribution. This refers more to storytelling. It can also be to gameplay. Basically, mechanics can be a turning point. For example, imagine that your character is going through their worst state. They are like so sad and depressed because this horrible thing has happened, and then you give them this mechanic, and then it's like, oh, now I can do this, which in turn will mean I can do that other thing, and then I can solve my problems, and everything is great again. And basically, by introducing a mechanic, you have kind of solved that character's life, and that is an emotional part that goes beyond what simply is pressing that button one and another time. Basically, I put this image here of Reinhardt. In fact, at the time in which I put this screenshot here, I had not fought Reinhardt. He's a boss of Fire Emblem. He's super busted. He has like 4 or 5 abilities, which is like normal characters have 0 or 1. So like this guy is top character. His weapons are extremely broken. He's amazing in all senses. And basically, I knew I was gonna fight him, and I was extremely hyped because he was gonna be a challenge. And it was even better than I was expecting because I got to use a lot of mechanics and to play around with what the game had taught me and had offered me. And basically, it was really great to fight him just for the way in which I used the tools of the game. And then we have understanding, which is the rational part of mechanics. Basically, oh, the capture mechanic. This screenshot, it's kind of a meme, but like the capture mechanic is probably the single best mechanic in the whole Fire Emblem saga, and it's only in this game, and that kind of breaks me inside. But it's amazing, and I'm gonna go really in depth when I make the Thracia presentation. Nonetheless, the understanding comes from the comprehension. Basically, you know what you're doing, because themes and rather the rational part of uh, storytelling or narrative, the captivation part, is something that is not fully realized until you finish the game. You can build it while you're playing the game, but it's not something that the player will have the full conception of until he or she finishes. Understanding is not like that. Understanding is precisely the contrary. It's something that you want the player to interiorize as fast as they can, and basically it's knowing what they are doing within the game, and those are the consequences that their actions are going to have, both on their characters and on the environment. It's the context. It's like what's going to happen within the world. It's the extra diegetic placement, which is the health bars, the meters, the timer, even like all those things that are part of the UX, or sorry, of the UI. Cost reward, obviously, like it's not so much what will happen when you do a certain action, but what is it that will cost you doing that action, and how those resources could be used in another place, in another situation. It's more of a what if scenario than what would actually happen. Execution, of course, like if there's a command grab in Street Fighter, well, you need to know it's certain motion. Relation to other actions, which kind of relates to the dynamics parts of the field. And the first order optimal strategy is basically you know what you're doing. That means that you will be able to take the better decision in every circumstance. So now that we've talked kind of the emotional and rational part that the player will kind of feel towards each part, that is the message and the mechanics, I said we don't care about the player, but actually we do. Plot twist. Because we basically have a target, and video games are not ideal creations of celestial essence, and therefore they exist in reality and have downgrades and downsides and whatnot. So basically, all those things that I've talked about are very pretty and very nice, but kind of have a problem that's you are not God, so you cannot really tell if your game are doing those things properly. So how to identify those facts, or those factors rather? This image I put here is basically in the early chapters. Two of your characters are kidnapped and put in this arena to fight units that are way above your league. And sure, one of those characters is your best character, no doubt, but it's still very tough. And you are supposed to rescue them, but you're not close, anyway, close to where they are. So you kind of are rushing into this situation. And like, sure, of course, mechanics play a part because it's a game, so you kind of have to move through mechanics. But the punch of this moment, which is not even a scene, it's a moment. It's story integrated within the gameplay, which I'm gonna talk later, but not now. It's mood captivation. It's the emotional and the rational part of the message of the narrative. And it's basically, of course, you feel for those characters because like they are part of your gang, and one of them, as I said, is your best unit. So you kind of, appreciate her being in your team, because if Abel leaves, you are screwed, kind of. And of course, there's also a theme, a thematic part of about this, of what it means for them to be in this situation, what it means for the boss character, the enemy characters, how they are gonna solidify themselves as the main threat of the game, precisely because of this action. What are the repercussions that it has on the protagonist, who has been very dependent on this person to survive and to kind of wait until he's strong enough to retake the country and whatnot. So there's a lot to unpack here. And basically, the way you can identify those moments. By the way, all of this is gonna be QA. Um, like anything that is knowing if your game is doing something properly, playtest, please, because you may have your head so up your ass that you don't realize what are the faults of your game. So playtesting is exceptionally important. So basically, what the things you have to ask your playtesting audience for is, did you feel attached to the story? Which is not the same. It's important to make the differentiation both for you and for the testers, because sometimes the testers don't really know what you're trying to mean. It's not the same as character attachment, because there's a lot of people, especially nowadays, that just see a character and the way it looks or the way it behaves, or just the fact that it feels good to play with it, is like, oh, I like this character. And it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't inform anything to your narrative. It informs to the experience, and that's important, but it doesn't to the narrative. So if you want to know if you're doing your pacing and your thematics correctly, etc., ask about the story, and if possible, to a person that has some kind of experience or some knowledge about how to, or what good storytelling looks like. It also has to generate this feeling of wonder, of course, wonder towards the story, because there's weird people, they exist, that feel wonder towards the gameplay. It's something I don't quite get. Maybe I'm the weird one, I don't know. But when I talk about wonder, I talk about wonder about the story, about what's being told. Empathy, of course, towards the characters. This is more aligned with the character attachment bit. It's wildly dependent on taste. We have to remember, of course, if you're doing a target, you're trying to nail a target, kind of explore what this target is about. And I'm not saying that your story should be catered and perfectly focused to satisfy their needs, but there are things, if there are things that you know are not really very interesting for this kind of target, try to avoid them. Because the most important part that you want from the emotionality of a player is for them to be allured, to be attracted to the game. They have to want this narrative to be part of the game, because there's a lot of problems within narrative based games, that is, you are trying to play and the story is not allowing you to, or you feel like story is an impediment to the gameplay. And that factor, allure, is going to be the thing that makes the difference. It's that thing that when you make, or if you make the player drop the control and look at a cinematic or whatever, the player is going to be okay with that. It's definitely better if you don't make the player drop the control, but nonetheless, I think that it's a feeling that's important to retain. So next, fluidity. Basically, the emotional and rational combination of the mechanics. If you know what you're doing and you enjoy, or it's comfortable to do what you're doing, you're gonna become fluid. Basically, the image I posted here is rescue chains. It's something that it's very accepted in the Fire Emblem franchise. It's something that is in almost all games, I think. And it's basically you can take one of your ally units and then pass it to another unit and then drop that unit. So basically, when you rescue a unit, your stabs drop, so you're weaker, and therefore, if you're exposed to an enemy, you are gonna have less chances to survive. But at the same time, if a unit is very weak and you can rescue them and you can get them out of the enemy's range, it's probably going to be a better option than to just leave them there to die. And a very interesting part of gameplay outside of fighting in Fire Emblem is making these rescue chains effective, is putting characters in and out of dangerous ranges and making sure that all the other characters are not being hurt or are not put in difficult positions because of that. And that's basically a feeling of fluidity. This is more something that you can see the player do by themselves. It's not something that you have to question so much. But of course, play testing is important because it's something you have to see during the playtesting. Basically, efficiency. It's a very clear factor that indicates that your game has good mechanical systems, optimal choices, which is important to remember that are dependent on playstyle. That means that you don't think that the perfect way to play your game is a specific one, because depending on the person, it will vary. What you have to consider is the efficiency within the game style of each player. There's an increase of mechanical pace. Obviously, you're gonna become better and more fluid at moving the controls and through menus and whatnot. And it's dependent on skill. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Curiosity. Okay, this is probably the less reliable of all. Captivation plus understanding. It's basically the union of the rational parts. I put the image of Sias here because he was a character I knew what he did and I knew uh, who he was, but I didn't really know how it was gonna play within the story or the mechanics. So I was basically excited to play with him, but apart from that, like kind of here to fill space, because curiosity can come from everywhere. As human beings are very curious by nature, so either it can come from captivation or understanding by themselves. It's not necessarily the combination of both that generates this. And as I say, depends on a lot of factors. The things that I think need more explanation, maybe the pace of the narrative. For example, if you're gonna do a narrative that starts really slow, the player may not feel curious. That doesn't mean your narrative is bad or that it needs fixing. It just means that at that point of the narrative, it's not very engaging. But maybe if you if it ramps up later and then you make the playtesting at that point, then the player is gonna be like, "Oh my god, this narrative is so engaging," and it's like, "Well, yeah, but that's just because I prepared, I laid the ground before making it more slow paced." So it's something that kind of depends more on where you're testing and expectations, of course, of the genre, of the person, of the conceptions of how you have been publicizing your game, cause a lot of problematics within this. The chances of experimenting with mechanics basically means this is a very tricky one. If you give your player time to be to test the mechanic, like if you tell, for example, the player, now you can jump. If you give time for the player to jump, they may feel accustomed to the jumping. They see the options of the jumping. They see how much it interacts with other mechanics and the dynamics it generates, and they are excited because they're like, "Wow, I want to see how the designers are thinking of using this very interesting mechanic they just introduced." At the same time, if you are like, "Look, you can jump. Now watch the 30 minutes of cinematic," it can be like, "Wow, I got this mechanic. I want to test it." And it's like they are curious. But at the same time, it can happen all the other way around. If your mechanic is not interesting enough, if you give them time to experiment with it, it's like they're gonna try like 2 or 3 times. And it's like, okay, this does this, whatever, and then just go away. In the same way, if you give them a mechanic and then you put cinematic or whatever, and then you're like, "Sir, I want to try my mechanics. Why don't you want me to play the game?" And then they get frustrated instead of curious. Perception of depth. This basically means how the player thinks that or like how the player feels they are gonna or you're gonna go deep within it, like how this mechanic is gonna evolve on time, or if it's just gonna stay like this and just not really go anywhere, or information overload or lack of, which basically is if you're giving a lot of information to the player, they may feel too saturated to think that this is interesting. If you don't give enough information, they may not quite grasp what you're trying to say, so they are just not really gonna be very interested in the mechanics, so they're not gonna be curious about it. And all of those basically summarize in player tendencies. Players are weird, players do whatever they want. It's a very much more open spectrum to realize if your story and your mechanics are interesting from a more rational perspective. And finally, fun, which is mood and feel, the emotional parts together. It's basically comfort within the game and not within the progression in it. It means that you are in the game and that's fun. Not moving, not acting in the game, it's just being in the game. You love the game because emotionally you feel attached to it. Like you can just put the menu of the game and you're like, ah, yes, I love the menus of this game. And you're literally just watching a screen, a static screen without doing anything. Music, by the way, has a strong part in this, but literally, like, it doesn't have to be like that. Just the menu. And it's like because you know those the characters that appear in the menu and you know what the game is about, you've grown attached to it. It's the first generator of engagement, and this is very important because no matter how good, how deep, how complex your game is, your narrative is, whatever, if the player is not having fun, if they don't have an attachment, if they don't think that it's worth, even if you present all those complex ideas, they are just not gonna care. They are not gonna look into it. They are not gonna pay any attention. So this first generator of engagement is the spring to depth, is the way, it's the door, it's the key to the lock that will allow you to go into complicated terrains, into expressing more complex ideas, and the player will eat all of that because they are having fun. And it's dependent on the person. But the good part of this, thanks God, is that it's shared for all the target. The whole idea of making a game for a target, which by the way also doesn't have to be a reason to make a game. Like your perspective on the game design doesn't have to be towards a target. It can be towards an idea or whatever. Like it can be 100 things. But if you're doing for a target, or if you have more or less an idea of what the genre or what the people that play a certain genre kind of wants to see, you know what core mechanics pertain to certain genre, and therefore what kind of fun that people are trying to go for. There is I don't remember how much it was. Like the kinds of fun. There's a classification out there of the different kind of funs. John Pons made a class about this. If you are here, I believe you should have gone through it. If not, I'll try to post it later somewhere. But yeah, there's a definition of what are the different kind of funs. Like a serious one, a classification done by an expert, someone that actually knows what they are talking about. So it's very interesting because once you have that and you know what you're searching for, you can tune things more towards that specter, and that's extremely interesting and extremely useful to achieve that fun that we want in our games. So we know what we want, we know how to identify it, we know how we want to construct our narrative, and we know how we will know if it works. Kind of, maybe not. This is very theoretical, I'm sorry. But I feel like it makes kind of sense. So now we're not done yet. How to avoid doing an interactive film, because this is huge problem of the industry, is thinking that story and gameplay are opposites. They are not. They really are not. What is story and what is interaction? What is the core meaning? What is the most artistical, pretentious way to understand those concepts? Basically, the beauty of a story, in my opinion, my very humble opinion, is that we become someone better by watching others struggle with a meaningful conflict. While the beauty of interaction is that we become someone better by struggling with a meaningful conflict, which is literally the same thing. And the only thing that changes is the perspective, is who actually goes through these stories. which is to me hilarious because like this whole dichotomy that we have been having in the industry about story and gameplay, it's the same thing. Gameplay is story, but like we don't seem to be able to wrap our heads around that concept. We're gonna ignore that quote because it's too embarrassing for me to actually talk about it. Jesus Christ, I'm pretentious. Anyway, meaning exists on the information that transcends the circumstances of the media. Basically, it's the idea that if you're gonna play something and that thing is emotional, it's impactful enough, and it's impactful because it makes sense and its thematics are well worked, it's gonna impact the player into a deeper level, and that's gonna change who they are. Hooray, art has been created. Meaning is what ideas are composed of. Therefore, the main idea of a good story is that it has meaning behind it. This is basically saying story needs a message. So, what are we gonna go into now? The first part was kind of what the framework consists about, and now I'm gonna try to explain what I think the relation between the mechanics and the message are. Like, how can you, and not necessarily the mechanics, but how what happens in your game affects the message and informs it, and how they relate. And it's important to note that story and interaction are the same thing, but the message and the mechanics are not the same thing because the message and the story are not equal. But nonetheless, message and mechanics are deeply rooted between each other. And I'm going to try to explore in which ways you can combine them without having to do separation between when the player plays and when the player is watching a scene. So, how to achieve meaning? Meaning by action. It's probably the main way of doing this. Um, you do something as the player, and that informs about who you are, who the character is, and their context. It's important to note that not every action carries meaning, or at least not every action in all games, because there's gonna be a necessary kind of transition between meaningful actions. Because in a way, as much as film, like everything in film, has a purpose and is trying to cut all the loose ends and all the unimportant things to just leave the essence of the film so that and the same for narrative and whatnot. Everything has to be relevant and everything is important and everything has a reason to be in there. Video game kind of has um, these accepted situations, let's say, in which you kind of have to transition from a thing to thing, or like from a meaningful part from a meaningful part. And that's something that doesn't really have a reason of being. It's just something that exists as a necessary evil kind of the media. And that's fine because you can minimize them and you can have them in the lowest degree, but they are still existing there. So it's important to note that not every action of the player is going to mean meaning. As I said, it's affected by all of these, and well, it's a pretty long list, but I'm not going to go into it because it's pretty self-explanatory. It's important to note bosses give us space to subvert or expand on a theme. And this is very cool because we've talked about bosses, and when we talk about narrative within bosses, we usually talk about what the boss is, what it represents as a character, and that's fine, but I think it's very limited. Bosses are also a way to give the player a room to do unique actions outside of the rest of the game. And that means like using some kind of object or some kind of interaction that are only found in that room. And what you would normally ask is why would you limit yourself to only using it there? And my explanation for that would be that basically you get to use that specific interaction as a way to inform the boss and therefore to inform its thematics and therefore to inform how those thematics affect on the overall message. And I just realized I should have put an example and I didn't because I'm kind of retarded. God damn it. Anyway, and I'm not only saying about dynamics, like it can be anything that's unique to the boss. For example, a unique way of killing it or a unique way to move to attack it. It can be anything as long as it relates to the message. It will have meaning and it will convey something about that boss. And by meaning, I mean something that expands on the thematics, but it can also be something as simple as um, you, let's say, um, describing or understanding in a better way who that uh, who that boss is. And the two examples, well, the one in the right, it's the Elder. I've already talked about him. He's my mortal enemy from now on till I die. The other guy is it's a boss of Thracia map 16 or 14. I don't remember. I think it's 14. And basically, his whole deal is that if you capture him instead of killing him, just a moment. Do I have internet? Yeah, okay. Because sometimes my internet just runs out and it dies, and I have to cry. And it would be a shame if I just am talking alone. Basically, this boss, if you capture him instead of rescuing him, rather, if you capture him instead of killing him, at the end of the chapter, he's like, "Well, that was pretty kind of you to not kill me, you know. So I'm gonna help you." And basically, him helping you, um, lets you get two more characters that were with you at the beginning of the game, and you kind of are supposed to have an emotional attachment to. Not in my case, but I get what they were trying to do. And at the same time, though, it informs about the meaning of rescuing or capturing someone. And it's like it's kind of something that breaks my mind every time, because the rescuing mechanic, it's so, it speaks so deep to what the themes of leadership and war that Thracia has, of like how good actions can be taken even in the face of violence, of the most radical opposition. It's amazing. I'm gonna talk about it on the Thracia presentation, because if not, this is gonna get out of hand. Meaning by reaction, it's basically once the player has an action, um, that reaction is gonna, well, the game is gonna send a reaction that's gonna inform about how the game considers that action, because it's really easy for the player to do an action and misinterpret what that action means within the context of the world. Maybe because the culture that the game character finds in, it's different and the player doesn't understand that. Maybe because the game wants the player to realize some nuisance. Wow, I just forgot how to speak English. Okay, how to like certain specific complications of the situation, and that the player may overlook. It serves as a counter argument. It's a way we have to understand meaningful narratives as a conversation. Sorry, meaningful interactive narratives as a conversation between the player and the game. So it's kind of the response that it gives to expand that conversation that they should have previously been having. Then there are two kind of a special meaning by reaction that I would like to emphasize. One is meaning by conclusion, which is basically when you reach the end of a character arc, which is not the end of the story, mind you. This would be more like the climax, and basically, it's when you have to give your final argument. It's when you have discussed everything that you could or everything that you wanted to touch upon a topic, and then that character does something or dies. They sometimes just die, or they disappear, or they find themselves into a certain situation. That when that is solved, you understand that that character's growth is done, and it's done because that central idea that was at their core has been solved, has been explained properly. And then we have meaning by cheating, which is kind of even my favorite way of conveying meaning. And we have Monica here to explain this. Monica is from Doki Doki Literature Club, which, if you don't know, it's kind of a visual horror novel thingy. It's kind of weird and experimental, and it has been stated to be an advertisement for the future game that the development team made. But it's like a game that lasts for like 2 hours or three, so it's not like a demo of 20 minutes. It's a bit confusing overall, but it's really good, and I love it because it the way it subverts everything, and how it uses that subversion not only for impressionism, but to actually say something meaningful. Like basically, if you know Doki Doki Literature Club, there's a point in which you have to make a choice, and it's a choice between the three main girls, and basically you're trying to press one of the three, but your mouse instantly moves to the third option. And like, haha, yeah, scary, spooky, but it also informs about who is Monica, and not only as like what's her essence as a existing being, but what are her themes, like on the themes of love, on controlling, on repressing. There's like, and it's stupid because the only thing that's happening really is that your mouse is being moved in the screen, but it just breaks everything that visual novels are built upon. And visual novels are just about clicking things on the screen, and it's not like even point and click, it's just clicking buttons on the screen. So it's like the most stupid thing ever, but it breaks everything of that. And honestly, I can't take it. I can't take it at all. And the other example I have here is Salem, which is another character from Thracia. And basically, his whole deal is that he is of the Loptian Empire. He's kind of one of the baddies, but he realized they were the baddies all along. So he kind of exiled himself, and now he's going to join you. And to get him, what you have to do is to capture him, and then at the next chapter, he's gonna realize that you're going into the layer of the thieves he was staying with, and he's like, "Oh wait, I can help you because this guy, who was my boss, um, he's chill. He's pretty chill. I just have to talk to him, and we'll make things clear and whatnot." And that's basically a way of saying, "Hey, if you help people, you get helped." Pretty cool. But yeah, more things that I have to talk on the Thracia exposition because this is pretty superficial as for right now. So meaning by external action, it's another kind of meaning we can give. Basically, the player doesn't really have to do anything. This is the way for the developer to say, hey, I want to talk about something. I want to settle the mood, control the pace within the narrative, because you can control it in other ways. We're going to talk about that. So instead of waiting the player to do something that I don't know if they will or will not do, and instead of forcing them, I simply give them the context, and then they can, follow that. In this case, I've put here an image of Darius. He's another character from Thracia. And at some point, he does something in the story, and then you basically kind of, wow, that just happened. And that thing that makes you say, wow, that just happened, gives you more information on who is Leaf, on what are the contexts that he's in. And basically, it's something that just happens in game, it's inevitable, but gives information and helps to build upon the themes that were established previously. This is basically just having a plot, okay? Like it's pretty simple. Meaning by existence. Now we're getting into some nasty stuff because this is not. This is more a diegetic kind of meaning thing. It's basically you have a character, use it to talk about your world and about what the world that you are talking about is about. And basically, I put Sarah here. Sarah is a daughter of the kind of the main villains. I want to expand on this, but if I do, I'm gonna butcher the whole plot of Thracia 776 and genealogy of the Holy War, so I better not do it. Um, Basically, like the whole idea is that the Lopkian Empire has been conducting child hunts. They have been kind of killing children. Let's say it's not really that, but kind of killing children to their dark god, because they are kind of a sect, and she's kind of a daughter of one of them, but she's not being hunted obviously because she's one of them. And that basically gives a whole meaning of what the Loptirian Empire is. It kind of stops them from being just in the same way that Salem here does, because he's also a Loptirian character that kind of goes to your side. Well, Sarah is the same, but she informs another different aspect. It's not so much that, well, not all of them are bad, of course. It's just a sect that is kind of brainwashing people into, uh, people, their descendants, basically. All the people from the Loptian Empire are kind of, we have been treated like shit, so we deserve to treat others like shit. And that's basically because people were really hateful towards them. So they kind of reinforce that ideology on themselves. But Sarah is informing the Lotkian Empire in a sense of they are not just totally gone. They are not just like child they see, child they kill. It's like they have a they have an awareness of themselves and an awareness of self-preservation. So like it kind of expands on them. And none of this is told. This is just because Sarah exists. We can derive all this meaning from this faction of the game. And then this can be expanded for like anything that the character is composed by can enhance their place in the world. For example, a very classic stereotype is the est stereotype. It's the kind of character in Fire Emblem that basically has very elevated growths, which means every time they level up a lot of stats, but they are very low level, which basically means that they are weak, and if you're gonna make them fight, they're probably gonna die. The kind of the turnover is that if you actually level them up, they're gonna become beasts, and it's gonna be a pleasure to play with them because it's like you put them in the middle of the enemy troops, and then like they are all dead, and you didn't even see it; it just happened somehow, and you're like, oh my, this game sure is easy, and it's easy because you've spent like maybe 12 hours of pain, suffering, blood, and sweat on trying to not get them killed, but leveling up at the same time, and it's fun. A lot of people like the archetype for this reason. I say it's roughly equivalent to characterization, but not necessarily, because characterization is basically fleshing out the character. This can just flesh out the world, not necessarily the character, or it can just not really give you any information or anything that's really interesting about the character, and it's just something situational and can be extrapolated to inanimate objects. For example, um, if you have a wall that has a graffiti, for example, in Portal has a room, I think to remember, in which you find like some writings on the wall that's like the cake is a lie, and that basically kind of gives you or makes you understand that there was someone before you that also underwent those trials that is not here anymore. So you kind of have to wonder why the heck they are not here anymore. And it's an object. It's not like you're getting informed by anything, but it's just by it being there, it gives you more meaning. It well, in this case, in the Portal case, I don't know if it gives meaning because I'm not that well aware of the Portal thematics, but I suppose to some level at least it informs you of the narrative. So in a similar way, you can, you know, cater that towards more thematic based meaning. Okay, mechanical meaning by mechanical change. Basically, this is not something that's done very often, but it's the idea that by introducing, limiting, or changing mechanics in some way, you can inform of something, of the themes or the characters. It's important to remember, and I'm going to go more in depth with the Celeste example, but it's important to remember that to consider, sorry, if they should be temporal or a replacement. Because if they are temporal, for example, say, I think there was a game that did this. I don't remember. Basically, you like kind of go on a low point, and then your character moves slower or like moves like more heavy because like they are more sad, and that's temporal. Because if you had to play the rest of the game like that, the player would want to like do something rash, because it's a pain in the ass to move a character that doesn't feel good. So you have to keep the user experience in mind. If that change, also the thematics are important. Always consider the thematics if you're going to do a narrative based game. Um, Basically, it's the idea that um, the character still has to feel good. Like the player still has to want to play the game. And therefore, if you're it's gonna feel bad, you can make it temporal. And if, for example, imagine the character just loses their mother or something, and they are super sad about it. Okay, their mother is not gonna come back. Like that's not gonna happen. Well, it can because magic of video games, but it supposedly shouldn't happen. And like the character feeling okay or returning to their normal state doesn't have to necessarily imply that they have gone over it. Like you can keep their grief, but express it in other ways, like in their clothing, in their speech, in their behavior, whatnot. But if you want to make it more evident at that point, because that's the lowest point of all, you can make a temporal adjustment on how they feel, move, attack, etc. And then like keep it normal. And if you think that it's not really affecting UX, if you think the player is gonna have equal fun on the future, you can make it either permanent or you can just serve as an upgrade or a replacement, and that's kind of what Celeste does. But we're gonna go on that later. Implies a change in the character's mind. As I said, it can inform about the thematics or the characters, which usually are supposed to be made uh, different so that they can inform the thematics themselves. And if done on an environment, implies a change on the world. Pretty cool. You can change the environment instead of the characters. You can change society. You can change NPCs. Everything is okay. Like as long as it informs what it has to inform, as long as it works on what you're trying to transmit and what you're trying to do as a final product, it's fine. So what Celeste does, for anyone that doesn't know, Celeste is amazing. Play Celeste. Um, Basically, the main character at some point overcomes the main hurdle of the game, and now she has a double jump. And this is a platform game, so a double jump is like, oh, so good. And basically, and I love this example because every single time that you're doing a double jump, like no new information is being conveyed. It's not like you're exploring the depth of the message or anything. But every single time you do a double jump, it's a reinforcement of what uh, going over the previous situation that Madeline was in. Madeline is the main character. Um, it's a reminder of that. It's a reminder of how far you've come, of how you're doing this, trying to not make spoiler to people who haven't played. It's mind breaking on a thematical sense because it never loses its power. Because and also by the way it's the story is presented in like every chapter is contained. It's not like there's continuity. It's not like you can get the double jump and then go back to the first level and start double jumping. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. Like I'm pretty sure it's self-contained on everything. I may be wrong. I'm sure. Well, I'm sure. I think I'm not. Um, so basically, at that point, every time you're doing a double jump, and even if it was, it doesn't matter, right? I'm just trying to carry another argument that I just realized wasn't really necessary and tried to discard at some point. Whatever. So yeah, every time you double jump, like it hits. Like if you think that you're double jumping, it's like, oh, that's so cool, and it's amazing. No matter how much used to it you become, no matter how many times you do it, it every time it means something, and that's kind of what we want in everything, but especially in mechanical changes or in mechanics in general. And finally, we have the most freaking cultured meaning, which is the meaning by narrative. That is any extra-diegetic context or situation that reinforces and links themes. That means basically, if you want to be an ass and seem very smart, you basically kind of have to do the narrative in a way that it presents some narrative tools. Or I think this, yeah, this has a name. I'm not gonna remember it right now. Whatever. Um, Basically you have these narrative tools that allow you to make these and more like hyperboles, parallelisms, cosmic irony. For anyone that, because I expect most of you know what those are, but if you don't know what cosmic irony is, basically the idea that a character wants something a lot, a lot, a lot, and basically the world just so happened to end in a circumstance that that character gets the absolute opposite of what they wanted. And it's like basically you feel like you're a joke to the universe, and that's why it's called cosmic irony. Basically, for anyone, for any cultured member of the audience here, Diablo from Part 5 of JoJo, the guy wanted to like just be chill and like rest in a well rest never be discovered and always like stay this shadowy figure who conducted their things and who basically like his theme or oh my god, we're gonna expand on this, are we not? Okay, basically Diablo's thematic is that he's skipping um every effort and going directly to the consequences. It's the idea of taking shortcuts. It's the idea of not putting effort and searching secondary ways to achieve your results. And basically, how he ends is by repeating circumstances, by repeating the effort, by repeating the actions that will lead him to die, but he never achieved the result of dying. And that's cosmic irony for you, basically. Pretty fun. Symbolism, reference, metaphors. Yeah, I think you all know what that means. Basically, at some point of the game in Thracia 776, Leaf and Selif, who is the protagonist of Genealogy of the Holy War, which is the previous game, and that happens at the same time, kind of, I'm not gonna go into that, as Thracia 776. Basically, the two main characters meet, and basically Liv is like, wow, I suck in comparison with you. And it's a very simple way to put it, but basically it's a parallelism that informs about both characters, about their context, about their themes. It's great. I love it. It's like a scene that lasts for like, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 lines of dialogue. It's not a lot, but it impacts me, at least, on a narrative sense. Then, we're going to the last part of the presentation. Let's go. Meaning versus interest. This is kind of a special thing I want to consider when designing conflicts. You have to remember, if you want meaning, we've stated meaning to be those the information or those situations that inform the player of what is going on. And because interactivity means that the player is going to be the one responsible for the choice of who he or she is at the same time. But we have a problem, and that's games present a difficulty, present challenge. So the player wants to surpass those challenges. And then we're going to have the conflict that player is going to be interested in doing those challenges, while you as a creator, as a very pretentious creator, you want to transmit a very fancy idea. So basically, you have to make sure that the choices, decisions, and mechanics that you're trying to come across with don't intersect with the interest of the player. The problem we have is a very serious one because it is a fundamental part of how the player experiences the game, trying to surpass these challenges, and it screws most of the things that you could usually think of as for in a simple way. So the ways I have found to surpass this are three. Make it a moral choice. It's basically saying, oh, you are interested in this, let me confront that. It's taking advantage of the interest. It's putting the emotional part against the rational part. It's kind of the elder problem that I've touched upon before. It's basically saying, well, it definitely would be more advantageous for me to use all those villagers as the bait for these arrows that are going to be flying on me. But at the same time, I have responsibility as a prince. And more importantly, I don't know how this will affect the world, who I become if I just kill a bunch of civilians to ensure my victory. There's such a gray area there that even if your interest is to sacrifice those villagers, you are not going to be so willing to do it without thinking like at least 147 times about it. Another option you have is to separate the choice from a reward. It's basically you have no interest. There is nothing for you to think it's going to lead to a most optimal route. It's simply emotional, rational decision. It's you have to make a choice, do it however you want, but just so you know, it doesn't matter to your game performance rather, because if it doesn't matter in general, then you're not doing a good choice. Or as a designer, I mean. Or finally, you can have the decision affect other characters. Basically, it's like, okay, so you can do. It's basically imagine the elder problem, but you know that depending on what you do, okay, let me rephrase that. It's like the elder problem, but if the villagers were your characters, actually, it's like, okay, I can choose these characters to sacrifice themselves, but they kind of are characters I care about. So there's this extra layer to the problem. Kind of similar to the moral choice, but having the decision affect other characters is implying that there's going to be an interest part for the player, but that's not the main focus. That's kind of what it differentiates it from the moral choice. So the objective is that the player takes decisions like it would in real life. It's basically we want as much honesty on the decisions of the player as we can. How to accomplish that? Immersion. Okay, tone and pacing. Basically, you have a way to control pacing and to control how the player feels. You have a way to control their emotionality, and that is that the message is irrational, but the presentation is the emotional part of your video game. Mechanics are used to establish a tone that we have kind of already said, but it's much more than that. For example, that thing I talked about requirements, about how you can, for example, have the meter of fighting games that gives an emotionality. Well, it's also a way to control pacing. If you have an ability with cooldown, it means that they can only use it for a certain times. It means they are gonna save it for big fights. So you know they are not just gonna storm the whole map with the same ability, spamming it like crazy. Like it's a good way to control pacing. Obviously, level design, anyone, kind of a good way to control pacing as well. But and of course, it's also a good way to explain to talk about narrative. It's just I didn't really include it here because level design, in a way, in my very complicated way of understanding things, I kind of envision level design as a part of the message, as a part of the narrative, the part of how you tell the story is level design. Like narrative, I just want to make clear, it's not just dialogue or cutscenes, right? Um, and more importantly, like I want to you to see those two gifs. There is a key mechanic here that it's killing the enemies. In Mario, it's through jumping. In Thracia 776 is by selecting the option of attack, and then you attack, and then they attack, whatnot. But it's very important because the tone and pacing that this same mechanic is establishing is very revealing of the nature of each game. In Mario, killing enemies it's not important. Killing enemies is irrelevant, really. What you want to do in Mario is reach the goal, is get to the end of the level. And the enemies are just an obstacle to make this more funny. Because if all you had was just a bunch of obstacles you had to avoid, you would feel like you have not that much agency and that you're very kind of weak. Enemies help you to give that sense of empowerment of like, look at how good I am, like no one can touch me, I'm Jesus, basically. In Thracia 776, the mechanic of attacking is a way to reinforce the themes of war. It's more serious. It has repercussions. It can mean a unit dying. That's a unit that's not going to come back because in this game you only get game over when your lord dies. And losing units can mean soft lock because you can get to a point in which like you only have 3 or 4 units left, and it's like, well, good luck finishing the final chapter with 3 or 4 units. It's not going to be possible, even though you're technically alive. And that is a conscious choice. That's kind of what is important about permadeath in Fire Emblem, is that your units have value to an insane degree. And that obviously kind of reinforced the theme of war and everything. And it's amazing. Fire Emblem kind of is, oh, so good. Anyway, before I start losing my mind over this, as you can see, the attack mechanic in Thracia, it's not simply something that happens instantaneously. There is a hype. The enemy goes towards you. You have time to say, "Oh my god, it's a 29% attack, chance of the attack hitting. Actually, like, is it gonna hit or is it gonna miss?" It has that hype building, and then the first attack occurs, and then you have your retaliation, and then you get out of the menu. So like, it kind of encapsulates it. It makes a grand spectacle out of fighting because fighting is important. It's key on how you understand how this war is happening. And it's interesting that the designers actually made an option to disable animations. So like you can kind of skip all these scenography, if you want to say it like that. But by default, it's active because the designers knew that this is important to having the feel of the game, to controlling the tone and pace. This is not just you move a bunch of units, yada yada, next part. It's about how this fighting ensues and the consequences of every action you're taking. And this quote of Mother basically is what Marita says when she dies. I put this quote another screenshot because no one has played Thracia 776 in the internet and posted things about it. So there's just no quote on this. And my Marita is, well, I guess I could have killed my Marita and then screenshot of that. I played with save state, so it wouldn't have even mattered anyway. But I kind of don't want to. So I kind of didn't, okay? And basically, this is important. It's very interesting. And I put this here for a reason. And it's when your character dies, it just doesn't die and just go back to the game. Because that is so important in Fire Emblem. They are controlling the pacing, they are stopping the action, they're stopping everything and saying, hey, this character has died. I hope you're conscious of that, and I hope you can sleep at night having done this. Good job, you failure of a leader. And then you feel bad, and it's like, things are happening. This has a reason. Those death quotes have a reason because character agency is so damn important in this game. Anyway, dialogue. Okay, it's gonna be the last one. Hold with me, please. Why did I do this presentation of this slide of dialogue, right? Because it's not really something that's gonna tell you how to convey your message. You can just do it mechanics, as I said. Narrative doesn't have to be a dialogue. But I'm goddamn triggered as heck, if I'm gonna be honest, about dialogue because it's used so wrongly and so ineffectively that it's almost painful. So I'm gonna try to do this more or less in a calm sense. Okay, so first of all, dialogue shouldn't be A equals B and C equals D. Now make your choice. That basically means we don't talk like that. Like my objective, what I envision, is a dialogue that feels realistic. Is the the chance to englobe how a person should be or can be feeling in a situation and then letting them express themselves. I know it's very generic and very idealistic and it's not happening right now, but there are ways to do it that we are not using in video games. Dialogue should be interesting and fluent interactions. And it's more than just lines of dialogue. Less is more. This is very important. I feel like there are tons of games that have just pages and pages of dialogue, and that's horrible because dialogue should be used as a way to explain things, to say meaningful stuff. If you basically, it's the idea of narrative, right? When I'm writing a goddamn book, I'm not like, oh, let me include all these dialogue so that the writer has more pages to read. That's, oh, Jesus Christ, that's the worst thing ever. So why are we doing that in video games? Why are we giving a dialogue to every single NPC? Like, please, no, it's not necessary. It's just what it's doing. It's this de-incentivizing most players because of course there's the weirdos like me that want to talk with absolutely everyone, and then it's like sometimes we end up disappointed because like, oh, so nothing interesting, not no. Anyone has anything interesting to say? It's like, ah, finally that one NPC. Okay, thank you. Um, but like for most players, what it does is they talk with a couple of NPCs and then they're like, bah, this is boring. And then they don't talk to any NPC for the rest of the game. And it's like if you had kept NPC dialogue or any kind of dialogue to interesting situations, to things that matter to the player, it's way more possible that those players would be constantly talking to people and constantly interacting with the world because they know that there is interesting things behind. That not necessarily rewards, not necessarily something that's just gonna give them the advantage or like objects or anything or quests. No, it just means that they are interested. The player feels immersed. It's such a great tool. It's being used like horribly. Uh then yeah, right. Tie the dialogue to players' actions. There's this character I've put the image of Palias. He's a character from Fire Emblem 9, from Path of no, from 10 game, Radiant Dawn. And basically it's kind of stupid because to get him, what you have to do is at least you have to have completed the game once, and then once you do that, and I'm not sure about this, I didn't check because it's not relevant to the conversation the conversation we're having, the presentation rather. Basically, once you've completed the game, you have to replay it, and then you have to like talk with the Black Knight 3 times, which is kind of like an antagonist of the game. Or that wasn't part of Radiance, I don't remember. But like you have to talk with Black Knight 3 times or something like that, and then you have to do a couple more things, and then now you have the option to recruit Pelias, and it's like it's kind of stupid, but I don't disagree the concept behind it, and it's the idea that you wouldn't be able to say certain things if you don't do certain things, and in the opposite way, it's even better. If you have done certain things, why the heck wouldn't you say things that relate to those things? And that's what kind of I said when I said that dialogue should be fluent and interesting interactions. It basically is a way to reflect who you are. If your dialogue is not saying anything about who you are, about what have you done, it's kind of looking at those things and saying they have no value, no meaning. Dialogue should be a way to look back on what you've done, on kind of inciting the player to take those steps, to be doing things, to interact with the world, so that when they interact with other characters and they have those dialogue options and they realize, oh, I did that thing, that was super epic, let me tell you about that, or let me suggest you something that I learned from that experience and whatnot. As far as I know, no one is doing that, or it's being done in a very limited sense. Like I've seen very occasionally, like all those, like there are some games in which like you have to do this thing and that thing and that thing and that thing, and then you get to do that action with this particular character. But those are like done very limitedly. Like those are things that just happen in very specific circumstances, and it's like oh, I think there was in the first games of Pokemon, I think kind of did this thing, this really cool thing in which like if you talk with this guy, then you have that other girl, like for example, that you can trade now, and it's like they are not interesting. Sorry, they're not interesting. They're not relevant, but it's interesting how they just like it connects the world, and there's meaning there. You can give meaning to the themes and everything you want to build upon. Like with the example I just gave of Pokemon, it's more like just world building, which is fine, but it's maybe not the depth that you're trying to reach. But like this kind of thing can be done to way more effectiveness, and I feel like it's being extremely wasted. More things. The image of Breath of the Wild. There's an argument to be made that in open world games, you want every NPC to have dialogue because yada yada. It's a good way to be interesting, to have the world be more alive if you want. So how do we kind of balance having a world that feels alive and breathing and realistic with not overloading the player with tons and tons of uninteresting dialogue? Well, Breath of the Wild took an interesting approach in which there are some NPCs that don't talk to you and simply have this kind of black uh, black bubble over them. That's kind of just some words you kind of understand what they're going about, if and they don't have anything else to say. You cannot talk to them. It's just they have that speech line and that's it. And basically you get they are going at their own, they don't care about your face, but they don't feel like they're just roaming. They are doing something, thinking something. They are someone, or you understand that they are supposed to be someone. And there are some other NPCs in which yes, you can talk. And most of the times when you can talk with someone, they're gonna tell you something interesting. And that's an amazing way to like conduct dialogue appropriately. And I think it's probably one of the best, if not the best, implementations I've seen, and very close to what ideally NPC dialogue in an open world would look like or should look like. More things. The power of not talking. I also think this is extremely important. The power, like I see, like the best I've seen this implemented is in mistakes. Is in like you're supposed to talk to this character, but wait, apparently you can do this part of the game without actually talking to this character. My bad. But what if it was taken and understood as something that the player can do for their agency, for just saying, I'm not going to talk to this guy. I know this guy, for example, is like a slave owner and he's kind of a dick, and I don't want to see his face. I don't want to interact with him whatsoever. So I'm just going to do my things. I'm going to undergo all those efforts and problems and situations that would have been solved if I talked to him. But the game is technically doable or completable, or you can continue the plot without having to talk to this guy. So, like, yes, okay, you're not talking to them, there's no dialogue, but there's such a powerful meaning on you taking the stance of saying, screw you, I don't care about your face, I'm living and doing my own thing. Again, not something I see very much because we feel like our players are idiots who cannot think by themselves and whatever. And finally, and kind of, I don't know if most importantly, but certainly it has its spice. Dialogue is a mechanic, and I have not seen a goddamn other mechanic in my short life that doesn't try to make mechanics fun. So why the heck is dialogue 99% just a box in which you select the option? Like, I know there are games that don't do that. For example, there's I'm not gonna remember because I watched a lot of GDC talks and things to prepare for this presentation. There was one in which they talk about how they made dialogue some bit more interactive. And basically, the dialogue appeared around the character and the form of the bubble and the color of the bubble and everything. The moment in which they appeared and how it related to the other characters. Like you could like dialogue was more than dialogue in that game, and that's kind of what we think we should strive for. Maybe that was very limited. There's another Danganronpa. I don't know how many of you know Danganronpa. Basically, there's this yeah, Danganronpa uses a lot of dialogue boxes, like unexcusable. But there's this because it's a visual novel. But there's this part of the gameplay in which characters start saying things, and like the words will start floating through the screen, and like you have to interact with words. The words are not just an element that informs you, but it's an element that you have to cut or to shoot at or to capture or things, right? Like, and that's dialogue, and it's a really weird. I'm not saying it's an amazing implementation of organic dialogue or in-world diegetic dialogue, but it's an interesting way. It's a mechanic. Dialogue becomes a mechanic, or rather, dialogue is treated like the mechanic that it is. And I think that's a very important and extreme wide topic to talk about that I'm not going to go in more depth. But yeah, dialogue is a mechanic. We should try to make it fun. We should try to be inventive of how we present our dialogue and what our dialogue means and is within the context of the game. Yeah, finally, yeah, this I didn't tell you how to write stories. I just tell you how to think of integrating a story in your narrative. Okay, so don't get too hyped and don't start thinking that you have suddenly become Hideo Kojima, because you have not. Not that I have played much uh, Hideo Kojima. I don't really know if he's good or not, but he's popular, so I'm just giving that meme there. Whatever. Examples or searches I've done in the internet: extra credits, GDC, and the second one I think it's a channel about game design that's not very well known, but it's pretty chill and cool. So I recommend you to go. Thank you very much. If anyone has anything to say, I would gladly. Oh Jesus Christ! I just hope that no,
Hi,
there.
hi.
I know, it just was.
So I like a lot when you highlighted the narrative. It's only the dialogues, but because this is a trait that sometimes can be easily forgotten, and I think it's nice. I also I want well congratulate.
Wait a moment. I'm not hearing you very well. Like, I don't know why, but like the audio seems to be a bit off. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. I said that I liked a lot when you highlighted that narrative. It's not only the dialogues, because this is a truth that can easily be forgotten. And well, I just liked it a lot. I also want to congratulate you because the presentation was really cool and interesting. I think it was a bit long and that could be definitely improving. But well, it's all right. Uh, Also, I have a question for you. Um, we often hear experts say that the video games industry, how it works, it's not sustainable. The budgets for games can keep increasing, but the retail price doesn't, and that video games need to be cut somewhere, like graphic quality, playtime, or narrative development. And you said it yourself that sometimes the development of certain narratives has a really high cost associated with it. Do you think that narratives are something that should not be cut under any circumstance?
Okay. Oh, I love this question. First of all, though, thank you for the compliments. I appreciate it. Second of all, I'm sorry. I know it's long. It because I knew it was gonna be too long, but at the same time, it was like, well, I cannot quite just do one part of the presentation because I feel it would be incomplete. But anyway, going to the actual question, do I think the narrative should never be cut? I don't think so. I think it's okay to cut it. Depends on the scope you want to do. Like if your main focus is narrative, it's not necessary to just make a lot of it. as I said, that game company, for example, with Journey, with Flow, with Flower, most of their narrative just relies on level design and on how the mechanics and the feeling of moving within the world gives you that impression, informs you about those themes. So it's kind of not too difficult or not too heavy to put a lot of resources on developing that mechanic, or rather that narrative, because it kind of goes along other things that already are gonna have to exist. Like in this case, most prominently the level design. But it's true that for bigger projects in which narrative has a more standard or more linear approach, or even branched approach, in which the main focus is, hey, a lot of things happen in the story, so watch the screen, please. It's like, mm, I don't think it's necessary. I think if you kept the key points, you can cut some parts, because, or simply just leave other parts for the player to experience through gameplay. um the problem I feel, and I'm not really sure because I've not really been in a lot of AAA studios. In fact, I've been in zero studios, so there would be that. But I think the main thing is that people start doing as a narrative, a story, and at some point they realize, oh, we don't have enough money, and then they are like, but this is already made, and then they kind of have to readapt things with a narrative that is half done, or that like was supposed to be in a way and then it's suddenly cut, or changes have to be done in weird places. So I think the key part is to make a, first of all, take the conscious decision that you want to do a narrative game, because if not, whatever, you don't care about the story then. But if you want to do a narrative game, plot based or just narrative in general, know your scope, know what you can spend, and do something realistic within that. I think that's the key, because if you do that, even if later you find out that you need more money for these, or you cannot put so much time on that other thing, because you will have those basics, because you know what the message is, how the mechanics enforce the message, you can be smart and think, okay, because I know what I want to say, because I know what is the core value of the game's message, I can just readapt everything to more or less fit that, and adapting to the costs that I'm having. So actually, I would even say that it's encouraged to cut the narrative and like reduce it, as long as you know what you're doing.
Amazing. Thank you. That was a really complete and perfect response, I would say.
I don't know if anyone else has any question.
Um, I would like to mention that the presentation as a whole had like a GDC quality to it in the way that you were explaining things. I mean, the analysis was so thorough that I was feeling like this was a GDC talk.
I really made a lot of research, and I wanted to give that feeling of completeness to the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really complete. It would. I definitely think it was really complete. One way you could have improved in it is for it to be more interactive. That way, it wouldn't feel as tediosa. No sé cómo decir tediosa en inglés.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you made the presentation a bit more interactive with the listeners, that way it would be a lot better. Even if the presentation lasts for 2 hours or more, you engage with the listeners, and the listener, you force in quotes them to pay attention to your presentation. That's one way to definitely improve it without cutting the uh, the contents of the presentation itself.
Yeah, it's actually like something I would really have loved to do, and definitely for the Thracia one, I'll try to be more like make more spaces and like let people, because probably at the mid part when I finished talking about what the elements of the framework were and then passed on to talking about how to express the different kind of meanings in a game, I should have probably done a break there and be like, anyone has any question, because like the topic kind of changed, but I didn't really like acted like it had changed. The problem is I kind of like watched all those videos and like made all those sketches and everything, and then I was like, oh, I have 3 days to do the presentation, hooray. And I was like, oh, damn it. So yeah, like I know it was gonna be, I knew it was gonna be kind of tedious to go over it, but I did my best. What can I do?
Any
I'm gonna definitely
particular
take it into consideration for the next time.
any particular reason why you wanted to make it in English?
No, the English thing is just, it's kind of a meme. Um, kind of like when I start ranting about anything when I'm alone at home, because that's the thing that happened. I just do it in English for some reason. So like it just started being in English, whatever.
Cool. Pues, tipo ya está.
Yeah, I just would like to clarify that even though I said it was a bit long, I still enjoyed it a lot. The presentation, I think everyone here did too. It's just I didn't think it was a bad presentation because it was long. I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, I understand. It's very fair criticism, really. I mean, I appreciate that, like the sincerity of people telling me that, dude, like you maybe kind of went overboard. But yeah.
Okay, Alex, ¿sigues vivo?